Hi everyone, here's the Chemist once again, and today I want to talk about a topic which is problematic and complex and difficult, but it's a topic I've been meaning to discuss a little with you guys for a very long time. It's a topic I've been thinking about for years, really, as someone who is a huge fan of H.P. Lovecraft. I usually say that he is my very favorite writer alongside Thomas Pynchon and Michael Chabon, but among these three, Lovecraft is the one I've known for the longest time. He really is the writer that kind of turned me on to the whole literature game, showed me how quirky, how complex, how peculiar, how mind-blowing literature and fiction can be. And it is the one among these writers to whom I go back most often. Again, this is a difficult topic, it's a complex discussion, and I usually don't police my videos too much. I tend to reply to your comments. I usually ignore the ones that I find more puzzling and that I really don't know how to take. I only really remove the ones that are clearly and very explicitly offensive, but this time I'm going to police this video, so if you have a very strong offensive opinion on the topic, please leave it aside. Please. Now, I'm fairly positive that every Lovecraft fan out there knows about some of Lovecraft's most contemptible opinions, but if you don't, well, H.P. Lovecraft, very famous, very seminal horror writer, supposed founder of the cosmic horror genre and of the whole Cthulhu mythos, which are enjoying a moment of immense popularity in popular culture, nerd culture, video games, board games. That guy was very much a racist. He wrote some disgusting pieces of racist poetry in his youth. There is a very perceivable element of racism and xenophobia throughout his fiction, and in his letters with his friends he discusses some very hideous opinions on immigrants, on race, on the fact that, according to him, pretty much only Anglo-Saxons and maybe potentially Germans are good races, whereas all the others are kind of inferior ones. And I don't want to play the race card in this video, because by all means I've never been in my life subject to any form of racism, but as someone who is Italian, that in a way touches me, at least tangentially, at least theoretically, let's say. What I mean is that if Lovecraft came back now and walked through the door, I think our conversation would be quite embarrassing. Now, the full extent of Lovecraft's racism is not going to be the subject of this video. If you're interested in that, there are lots and lots of books you can read to access what kind of person he was. I'll put a link to a few ones in the description box. It's not my aim now to discuss whether he was, say, more or less racist than other writers, people like Charles Dickens, people like Edgar Allan Poe, also because that would kind of go against my main point, as I'm going to develop in the video. Some people will tell you that, well, that's the way people in the 1920s and 30s thought. Other scholars will tell you that, well, actually no, even for the 1930s he was pretty fucking racist, but that's besides my point. I'm not going to discuss and to address that. Lovecraft's racism had never been a secret, but it was brought to the forefront of the literary world, and it was discussed in literary magazines, in literary websites in 2011, I think, when Nnedi Okorafor, a Nigerian-American writer, won the World Fantasy Award. In the past, when you won the World Fantasy Award, they gave you a bust of Lovecraft as a statue. It was kind of a caricature, and Okorafor, whose novel Lagoon, by the way, I'm currently reading, and it seems truly awesome. It's right up my alley. I'll probably be reviewing it on my channel. Okorafor wrote an article on her perplexity in being awarded the statue of such a racist person, and other writers chimed in. ST Joshi, the main Lovecraftian scholar working today, also opposed this controversy. He raised some points about this kind of debate missing the point, about literary appreciation, focusing instead too much on Lovecraft as a person rather than Lovecraft as a literary figure, but the way I am summarizing the whole argument is going to make it sound simple, and it wasn't. Okorafor didn't at all say or write that Lovecraft should be banned from libraries and bookstores or such, and Joshi's point wasn't that, well, we should just excuse him because you know, literature is not about that stuff. It was much more complex, and again, I'm going to post maybe a few key links, but no amount of links I can put in the description box can give you a full picture of the situation. You'll have to do some independent research on that if you're interested in that stuff. Now, my take as someone who loves Lovecraft's fiction, someone who fell in love with it at 15, 16, and since then I've discovered several writers that I appreciated immensely, and then suddenly I didn't like them anymore, but Lovecraft has stayed, he has stuck. I keep going back to his fiction. It has helped me see the world through a different lens, or actually what happened was that it helped me understand the way I saw the world in that way that literature does, and that it's beautiful, you know, that it talks about stuff that you already knew, but you didn't know how to put it on paper, how to say it into explicit words, how to turn what you had in your head into beautiful sentences. Without waxing lyrical though, my take, also as someone who is from Italy, a country on whose money, on the €2 coin in Italy, you get the face of Dante, whose Divine Comedy is, in my opinion, but I mean in most people's opinion, one of the very, very, very best pieces of literature ever written, but it's also a very controversial piece of fiction. Hell is filled with people whose sins we would not at all consider sins today, hopefully, if we are even just a tiny bit enlightened. My approach to these type of books with controversial opinions and outdated views has always been to take what I can appreciate out of them and to not really ignore, because that will be incredibly wrong, but to keep in mind that the bad is there and to weigh it alongside the good that I can find in this stuff. That is also because what I like about literature so much and about fiction is that it is outside life, that it is art, that it is built up by people. It's entirely constructed by human consciousness, and people are all over the place. The author, the reader that the author is writing for, but at the same time fiction is not people. What I'm trying to say is that writers, lots of writers, even writers who maybe never expressed racist views, inevitably, because they are people, they are going to be disgusting in one way or the other. All of us, if we stop and think about it, maybe there's a certain thing we don't really care that much about, or maybe we feel strongly about something but do nothing to change the situation. People are flawed, and that's supposed to be the way, whereas literature can be beautiful exactly because it's outside people, it's external, it's made up. But this type of attitude, prioritizing aesthetic appreciation rather than ethical or moral concerns, is a very slippery way of approaching fiction. The usual objection to this view, and it is a sensible objection, is that, well, you know, Hitler was a painter. Had he been a better painter, had he been a very good painter, would we be supposed to appreciate his stuff and put it in museums? That would be ridiculous. He is fucking Hitler. The situation, as with all human matters, is incredibly nuanced. There can be no straightforward solution. Literature teaches us that straightforward solutions are usually bad and they ignore the complexity of a situation. What I'm trying to say, and probably you have to consider this stuff on a case-by-case basis. What I'm trying to say is that saying that art should have precedence over all sorts of moral concerns, and that it is wrong to fail to appreciate something or even censor something because that will be an infringement of free speech freedom. That's the kind of attitude assholes use to justify their hate speech. I firmly believe in that, but I also believe that there is something wrong in reading fiction and approaching books because you are convinced that they're written by good people. I think there's a basic misunderstanding on what fiction is supposed to be in that idea, and that when people focus on a certain writer or focus on a certain genre because that's supposed to be written by good people, well, maybe there are better ways of doing something good for yourself or for the world or for getting to know good people and their work. But what do I know? It's just my opinion. And I have friends, for instance, who started reading Dave Eggers' fiction because they knew about his activism. And that is, it's not like it's wrong. Of course, maybe that's not the way I go about discovering writers, but maybe I'm also a bit of a slob, and I'm not saying that those people were wrong. See how complex discussing all this stuff is? But I mentioned that idea of discussing these issues on a case-by-case basis. What about Lovecraft? The point I'm going to make, and it has been my experience, and by all means tell me if your experience has been different, is that I never perceived Lovecraft's stories to be racist. In fact, it seems to me that they do a very good job at being anti-racist. For the love of God, there is an abundance of racist views in them. Stories such as the Horror at Red Hook, the Call of Cthulhu, the Shadow over Innsmouth, Rats in the Walls, they all have these hideous views on immigrants, on minorities, The Hunter in the Dark, The Color Out of Space, these views on minorities and newcomers to America as kind of inferior people to the original Anglo-Saxons who supposedly settled New England and this part of the United States. And there is lots of horrific stuff in there that it's just cringe-worthy to read. What I mean is that, be it because of some subconscious conviction of Lovecraft, or be it because of his broader philosophical view, Lovecraft is not the kind of writer who can truly be used by fascists or by racists to make a point. Lovecraft was a racist, there is no doubt about that, but even more than a racist, he was someone who was disgusted with the world and with humanity at large. In his stories, it never really happens that you get the heroic Anglo-Saxon characters fighting off and defeating the hideous, evil immigrants or Asians or people from the Pacific. What usually happens is that at first, these minorities are described as monsters up to a certain point, and by the end of the story you realize that the main character, that wasp guy, is even more hideous and more monstrous than all the others. Take the Rats in the Walls, one of the stories that is most often pointed at as proof of Lovecraft's racism. There is a cat in that story that is called the N-word, that is his name, and that's horrible. But by the end of the story, by the time you reach the end of it, and I'm going to spoil you the Rats in the Walls, so if you haven't read it, go read it. It takes like 1 hour, probably less. By the end of the story, it almost seems as if the text is making fun of the main character's racism, because yeah, it was such a, it was so hilarious as to name his cat that way, but by the end of the story you realize what a monster he is. And we are talking about monsters on a biological level, on the level of his blood inheritance. So it's almost as if Lovecraft is using racism against Anglo-Saxons. The very same thing, spoiler alert, happens in The Shadow over Innsmouth. Early in the story there are all those paragraphs, jarring, cringe-worthy paragraphs about how wrong it is to mingle with people and savages from the Pacific and from the Polynesia and all those islands. And by the end of the story, you realize that the main character, who thought he was different, who thought he was a pure American, whatever that is, well, he discovers that he is a monster. The sense I always got out of Lovecraft's stories is that these obsessions with ideas of race and ideas of the superiority of a certain ethnic group over another are kind of pointless, because at the end of the day, we are all monstrous in our own way, and it's pointless to pretend otherwise. Actually, there's also the case of The Hunter in the Dark, where the Italian community of immigrants, it's not like they're really better than the protagonists, but at least they are wiser. But I'm not making a case that Lovecraft secretly wasn't a racist, or that maybe subconsciously he was not. What I'm trying to say is that the way I read the text, and I always read texts as they stand without considering what kind of person produced them, the way I read these texts, it seems to me like they make a very good job at diffusing their own racism. Also, because of the way I read without caring too much about the author as a human being, this is not necessarily of interest to me. I'm more interested in text as aesthetic works, but it's also interesting to notice, if you are into that kind of stuff, if you're into sociological readings of fiction, when you study Lovecraft's life, it's very clear to understand that his racism came from basically his fear of the modern world. He believed he was this old man who came from some supposed noble past. When he lived in Brooklyn, very close to immigrant communities, that was a traumatic experience for him. That also might be motivated by the fact that he moved from a rather comfortable youth to a shameful adulthood, where his literary works, basically no one cared about them. He had to struggle to make ends meet, he had to work on other people's fiction. All these feelings of shame, envy, fear for the future, they all coalesced into his racist views, which is, my God, it's not a way of excusing them. Please, I hope this is clear. What I'm trying to say is that understanding Lovecraft's racism can help us understand today's racism too, because it seems to me that, at least in my home country, in Italy, it seems to me that much of today's xenophobic views come from a similar perspective. They come from people who have certain ideas about the past, about how in the past things were different and maybe they were better for them, and so their fear of the future, their inability to understand what's happening in the present, it turns into these very ugly feelings, and we have to understand them in order to change them and to fight them, I believe. Lovecraft's cosmic horror and universal pessimism is usually taken for granted by fans and dismissed a bit easily, as in, yeah, of course he believed that humanity was meaningless and that was the whole point of his poetics, but that's a much more complex and much more annihilating worldview than it is usually taken to be. I firmly believe that Lovecraft shares the same fate as another writer whose, well, some of his works I absolutely adored some time ago, but that maybe I've grown a bit more skeptical about them later, which is David Foster Wallace. Lovecraft and Wallace are both writers whose poetics and worldview is very complex and very difficult to share, even just to comprehend fully, but that they are also both writers that they enjoy an immense popularity, and I have to admit that I believe that that's because most people maybe they only really appreciate them for a simplified version of their poetics. And this is going to sound snobbish, because it's going to sound as if I know how to read them well and you don't, but I do believe that sometimes fans simplify the worldviews of these people, with Wallace the point being that his fiction is incredibly difficult and incredibly complex, and people often assume that he is all about irony is wrong, we should just be sincere with one another, and then we would be better off. So that's it for Lovecraft's racism. Does the fact that I perceive it as self-diffusing, does it mean that it's not an issue? By all means, no. And I especially want to hear from people who had a hard time reading Lovecraft's more racist stories and even had to stop reading them, or that who cannot really appreciate them fully because of that element. It makes absolute sense. We all read in a different way. It's what makes discussing literature so fun. But what about Lovecraft's misogyny? The fact that he really never populates his stories with women, kind of not at all. That to me is, well, I don't want to compare the two horrible stances. What I'm going to say is that I think Lovecraft's misogyny is kind of impossible to defend. It is true that women play basically no role in his fiction, and that entire side of the world is absent in his poetics. I don't want to say that Lovecraft's fiction is monochrome, that it's all only and always about a certain thing, a certain view of the world from a certain perspective, because that's not the case. Lovecraft's fiction, especially if we consider his more fantastic works, more fantasy stories, especially from early in his career, his fiction is more nuanced than people usually assume, but if it's not monochrome, it's painted in 2, 3, maybe 4 colors, but large chunks of the human experience are lacking from his oeuvre, and that's obviously indefensible. The only objection to Lovecraft writing that I take issue with is when people say that he wrote badly. And my God, lots of writers and critics I admire embarrass themselves with this idea that he couldn't write well or that his writing is ugly. Of course it is. It is clogged with adverbs. He is never really very good at setting up a scene or at making a story, at keeping up with the pace and the rhythm of a story. He often has to repeat things 2, 3, maybe 4 times. But saying that is ugly writing is every bit as idiotic, if you ask me, as saying that, I don't know, Picasso's paintings are ugly because they don't look like people. You assume a certain way of portraying the human experience to be good, and forms that don't conform to that are bad or ugly. You get what I mean. I'm not going there. I'm not going to discuss Lovecraft's prose, because that is a very it's another complex topic and another long video, and this one is already long enough. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and please contribute your experience, contribute your ideas on this in the discussion in the comment section below, and let's keep the discussion positive. Let's admit that all of us are going to approach these very difficult topics in different ways, and hopefully there won't be any fight. I will see you in the next video. Bye, guys.